me, no? So again, good morning to everybody. We are very happy to start the cycle of conferences of this semester with the conference of Professor Barry Naughton. I remind you, we will have a very interesting semester with 8 conferences. As usual, very heterogeneous conferences on issues regarding international relations, business issues, firm level analysis, but also including conferences on Maoism and other topics. No? 8 conferences like we have been doing since 2005 with 300 and plus conferences since then. All of these conferences you can look and download at our webpage. No? I remind you also the cycle of conferences is a joint effort of the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies, and we do this together with Professor Yolanda Trápaga since 2005. No? Today we are very happy to start this cycle of conferences with an ongoing effort since 2018, when Professor Barry Naughton visited our center in 2018, and when he gave a group of conferences that you can look also at the webpage of Cechimex. This was also thanks to the professorship or chair on Mexico and China, Eugenio Anguiano Roch. Eugenio is with us, so I'm very happy to see Eugenio. And thanks to the effort also of Agenda Asia and Simone Levy-Daba, who supported this chair or professorship. No? As a result of this cycle of conferences in 2018, Professor Barry Naughton was so kind and with a lot of patience of us to allow to publish this book, The Rise of China's Industrial Policy, 1978 to 2020. All of you can download the book for free. We will have the possibility soon to have shipped the book by Lynn and Reiner, but this will take a few days, maybe even at the beginning of next week, we will start with this. I remind you, Professor Barry Naughton, he's a professor of Zhou Quan Loc of the Global Policy and Strategy and at the University of California in San Diego, and a very well-known analyst, economic analyst of the Chinese economy for several decades, no? With a wide group of publications of books, articles, and journals. Well, we are very much looking forward to hear his presentation, his analysis of his book. I remind you the book has 6 chapters, no, including the conclusions. And I believe it's an interesting reference for both analysts interested in China and on the issue of industrial policy, but also for a wide group of Latin Americans and Mexicans interested in industrial policy beyond China. No? The dynamism of the presentation of Barry will be, as we have been doing before, a presentation of 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will have another 30 to 45 minutes with a group of rounds of questions. I remind you, all questions are being posted through the chat of Zoom. No? So thank you very much, Barry, for your time, and the floor is yours. No? Good morning again.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I certainly remember well the hospitality that Cechimex showed. Was it back in 2018? That's amazing, so long ago. All we can say for sure is it was pre-COVID, right? In those wonderful pre-COVID days, I just hope that they will come back and we'll once again get the opportunity to see each other face to face and share things personally. I guess I will share my screen to so everyone can see as you can see, I've updated by 1 year from industrial policy 1978 to 2020 to 2021, because as I'll show at the end, certainly the effort that China is putting into industrial policy most certainly has not slowed down during 2020, 2021. On the contrary, it's rather stepped up. So I do want to talk about a number of things. So let me just be clear that the overall structure, the arc of what I'm talking about is quite straightforward and follows what's in the book. Enrique in the book gave me the opportunity to bring together some work from different time periods. Some of it describes the earlier period, and if you're interested in it, very much encourage you to read those chapters and come back and tell me what you think about them. But for this presentation, I'll stress some of the later material that's the more contemporary things that are going on in China. But let me just point out sort of the arc of the book. It really is to stress that China's industrial policy has really gone from nothing to an extraordinary scale, an extraordinary commitment of resources that is really unlike anything we have seen in any other country. So even though we talk about industrial policy, there's a sense in which what China has done both before and today really breaks the bounds of what we ordinarily think of as industrial policy. Before, say, 2006, I would argue very strongly that although China did, many things where direct government intervention was crucial in the transition process to a market economy, but it really didn't have an industrial policy in the sense of selecting certain sectors for priority promotion and driving them forward ahead of other sectors. And then policy was just changing in the middle of that first decade of the 21st century when the global financial crisis came. And in the wake of the global financial crisis, China took this industrial policy, which already existed, but just barely, and supersized it, just accelerated it dramatically after 2010. So that what China is doing today is something much bigger than we normally think of in terms of industrial policy, much bigger than what Japan or Korea did in the 1960s and 70s. It's something that really goes beyond simple industrial policy. And I've taken to calling it grand steerage, because I just want to emphasize that the Chinese Communist Party today is committed to the idea that they can take China's economy and steer it in the directions that they want. It's not planning, but it's a degree of government self-confidence and willingness to shape the economy that is really, really unprecedented. Now, I want to stress this overall arc before I start, because 3 reasons. First of all, there's a very significant possibility that China has, in essence, overshot. In other words, we have lots of evidence that what we can call a light touch industrial policy can be very effective in improving the performance of the economy. But China has, in some sense, gone from too little to too much without pausing in that medium point that would be the most effective in terms of combining substantial economic dynamism, which of course China has, with a small degree of government steerage that would help to make the process even smoother. So that sort of reflects my own personal evaluation, although as you'll see later, I clearly think it's too early to have definitive evaluation, but that's sort of my general view. And because China has swung so far, here's the second thing. These policies create significant domestic economic risk for China. And of course, they also have created an international backlash. We'll see how this plays out in the WTO over the next couple of years, we don't know. And third and finally, in these preliminary points, because of this pattern, it's easy to misinterpret what has gone on in China over the past few decades. Has China's industrial policy been a success? Well, how would you determine that? The enormous success of China's economy in the 3 decades between 1978 and about 2008 came really with very little industrial policy. And the decade where China has been following industrial policy, certainly there are important successes of the Chinese economy, but it's hard to argue that it's any more successful than it was before the onset of this big industrial policy. So that's the sort of background arc of my reasoning, and that's the arc that the book follows. So that's the structure lying in the background. Let me just run through, 1 or 2 of these points relatively quickly, and then we'll focus more on what's happening today. So first of all, just to stress this first part, remember, by the time we get to the global financial crisis, by the time we see this distinctive shift in Chinese government orientation, China had already been growing at 10% a year for 4 decades, or 3 decades, rather, sorry. And so during this period, right, during this very, very rapid growth period, if we look at the structural change in the Chinese economy, was it predominantly towards the kind of high-tech sectors that China targets today? No, of course, not at all. Right? It was a market-driven process where private firms and foreign investment drove the Chinese economy more towards areas where it had comparative advantage. And that meant, especially at that time, labor-intensive manufacturing. And government planning was irrelevant, pretty much. That doesn't mean government policy was irrelevant. Government policy was extraordinarily important because government policy had to devise an effective market transition strategy. And they did it, right? But that was their predominant goal. That was their predominant objective. It's true that we can see in the background, there are 5-year plans. There are occasional industrial policies. And in the book, I go through a couple of the most important ones. And you know what? They all fail. That is, they're not good predictors of what's happening in the economy. And we don't see any signs that they shape economic development. And that's really not surprising when you think about it, because they didn't have good information about structural change in their economy. They didn't have useful instruments to shape the economy. And also, especially in the 90s, they were strapped for resources. So that traditional China success story is not a success story about industrial policy because there wasn't any. All right. Here's a detailed definition. I stress vertical versus horizontal policy. We can talk about that later in Q&A if you like. Just to stress that I'm using a pretty narrow and precise definition of industrial policy when I make these sweeping statements. But then, of course, everything changed, right? Because around the end of the first decade of the 21st century, Chinese policymakers knew, they understood, hey, this period of 10% per year growth, that's going to end. This can't last forever. It has never lasted forever in any other economy. Plus, of course, they had just had this experience of coping with the global financial crisis through a strong stimulus program. So they were going, we can do this. We can use government intervention to shape what's happening in the economy. And so they took the very small light touch policies they had already started, and they bundled them together in a program that they called Strategic Emerging Industries. And they decided, strategic emerging industries are the key that will create new growth drivers that will keep growth high, even though we're moving out of the miracle growth phase. In other words, we don't have to be like Japan, which grew just as fast for almost as long, but then when the end of that miracle growth phase came, fell into the famous decade of stagnation. So we think we can avoid that. And so these strategic emerging industries, and the key thing about the strategic emerging industries too, is that they weren't a simple catch-up strategy. The guiding idea, it didn't always work so appropriately, but the guiding idea was that strategic emerging industries would be areas where there weren't clear incumbents in the developed countries. So electric vehicles are the classic case of strategic emerging industries, because they looked around and they said, well, in EVs, there's no Toyota, there's no Volkswagen. We might be able to be the Toyota and Volkswagen of the future. And so right from the beginning, there was this strategic, meaning occupy a new area consideration, along with, of course, this consideration on so-called strategic technologies, never defined, but being these core technologies that Xi Jinping in particular is associated with the idea that China needs to control those core technologies. And then this strategy was expanded and given an even stronger philosophical basis with the so-called innovation-driven development strategy. And this is really the fundamentals of Chinese policy from 2016 to today. So now it's been in place for almost 5 years, and it's very much a strategy that's based on not just technology. I'm going to show you, sorry, I should have said it's a kind of portmanteau strategy that includes lots of different plans, like Made in China 2025 is a component of this bigger strategy. But it's got this very strong, philosophical underpinning. Here's a couple of quotes. I just want to read the first one, right? This is part of the official, top level government document that defines the strategy. It says, a new round of global technological revolution is accelerating. A group of revolutionary new technologies, intelligent, green, and ubiquitous, are reshaping the global competitive landscape and changing the relative strength of nations. Right? So you see that this very strong, there are two components right in there, right from the beginning, right? One is the notion that there is a new technological revolution. It's defined by artificial intelligence, ubiquitous sensors, high-speed 5th generation telecom, environmental upgrading, comprehensive electrification, right? It's there is a belief that Chinese planners can see into the future because of the enormous impact of this technological revolution. And that this immediately has enormous implications in terms of geostrategic logic, in terms of national strength, in terms of, it's not stated here, but of course everybody understands it, in terms of rivalry with the United States. Okay, so these are not just growth policies, they're also strategic policies. And so a lot of words on this page, but the simple point is that this industrial policy serves multiple political objectives and is thus political and economic objectives, and is thus in some ways at the core of what Chinese policymakers are trying to achieve. And that means that they have put tremendous resources into the elaboration of this policy. Actually, one thing that's really difficult is to try and trace the scope of all the resources that flow into sectors that the Chinese government is now promoting. So in other words, turn of the century, that number was very close to zero. And today it's really big. There are many, many channels. It's really hard to trace all of them. But one component of them we can trace very easily. They publish all the data about something called government industrial guidance funds. And these are interesting in their own right as well, because they show that even though Chinese government is enormously ambitious, it also seeks to preserve the advantages of the market economy that was created during the transition process. China, the government is ambitious, it wants to steer the economy, but it understands that it cannot do this unless it maintains at least most of the efficiency benefits of a market economy. So in search of this goal, Chinese government set up these industrial guidance funds. The most important one is the National Semiconductor Industrial Guidance Fund. These funds set up, they register. When they register, they set up a designated fundraising scope, and that's public record. So we can track the growth of these funds and look, by the time we get to 2020, the designated fundraising scope of these funds is $1.5 trillion US dollars, right? So that is $1,000 billion in these funds, not 100% paid in, but we estimate about 3/4 paid in. So that's still over $1 trillion in these funds. So the effort is quite substantial. The rate of setting up the funds has slowed down recently, so it's not necessarily a 100% smooth process, but still they're big financial players. And this really tells us something about what China is trying to achieve. These funds, along with the still state-dominated banking system, means that the government doesn't have to just set up programs and distortions of the economy. They can use financial resources and other kinds of resources that can be structured in a way that the incentives for the decision makers are at least reasonably in accord with the demands of a market economy. So these industrial guidance funds raise money from limited partners, just like a venture capital fund. The actual investment decisions are delegated to a managing agency that becomes the managing partner in the same way, again, as a venture capital fund. And so the incentives and the oversight of these funds is definitely better than what used to be the case in China, where you've always had various kinds of funds floating around under the control of local governments, sort of local government slush funds. These are an attempt to improve on this by making it more transparent and more appropriate to a market economy. I should say that I'm going to describe over the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to describe programs and aspirations. There are lots of flaws and shortcomings in these, but I'm generally going to describe them in terms of their objectives, keeping in mind that, of course, reality will fall short. And this is the case here as well. Just because they don't perform at 100% of their objectives doesn't mean they're not working. But at the same time, obviously, we can't just assume that because somebody says they're going to achieve certain things, that's just automatically going to happen. That is certainly not the experience in the past with Chinese policy and planning. But they're certainly very, very huge, very, very important. They involve a really massive effort to shift the direction of the economy towards all the areas in which the new technological revolution is taking place. Now, so as I said, that's been mostly in place since 2016. What do we see right now? We see that this effort is not only continuing, but in a certain sense, accelerating. 2020, of course, for all of us, brought the tremendous economic blow of the COVID pandemic. And as everybody knows, China was the first economy to experience it and the first and the quickest to recover. So China grew in 2020, one of the very tiny handful of economies to grow, and the only really large economy to grow. So China's share in the world has increased. China's GDP as a share of global GDP increased in 2020 by about 2 percentage points, which is incredible in the historical record. And as part of the return to growth, China stepped up its investment in infrastructure. That makes sense because obviously consumption is depressed by the pandemic, by the disease, and therefore to keep growth on track, it makes sense to step up domestic infrastructure investment. But this infrastructure investment has a very important characteristic. The first is that it's so-called new infrastructure, meaning that concrete is being laid, but with the intentional design to incorporate elements of the information and artificial intelligence revolution. That is, it's being laid out with sensors, with communication nodes, and with the ability to process real-time information. And at the same time, and perhaps not surprisingly, China has been adopting a very important modification of its urbanization strategy. In fact, they sometimes call it Urbanization 2.0. Now, I'm sure everybody here knows that urbanization has been a huge driver of Chinese economic growth in the past couple of decades. Urbanization 2.0 commits the government to building out more urban infrastructure in the form of more new cities that are designed to create clusters of urban nodes in each, especially of the 3 major eastern metropolitan regions. So around Beijing, around Shanghai, and around Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. This means that the technological emphasis of industrial policy is increasingly merging with the high investment policy that's been a traditional standby of Chinese economic policy. That means more resources and a more powerful force to shape the growth trajectory. And then 3 and 4 are a couple of other important short-run changes. Let me come back to that at the end. And just to set the stage for this, reminder that China already invests far more as a share of its GDP than any other economy. So please, I don't know if you can see this, my cursor. I'm circling this area where the China gross fixed capital formation as a share of GDP is at 45% of GDP starting during the global financial crisis, starting in 2009, but then basically staying high subsequently, so that in 2020, we project that the investment rate will once again be approximately 45%. So China has now, for 12 years in a row, invested substantially more than 40% of its GDP in new fixed capital. So that's about 3 times the high income countries, about 3 times the middle income countries, and more than 3 times what either the US or Mexico invests in a normal year. So this is huge. As I said, smart infrastructure is the key innovation in the last couple of years. And it's easy to see how this comes together, right? China was already famous for investing a lot. That surge in investment was associated with the creation of the high-speed rail network. A new 5G telecom infrastructure was going to roll out anyway. So to take these initiatives and unify them in a smart infrastructure program totally makes sense. So then the last element here, and we saw glimmers of this a couple of years ago. I think when I spoke at Cechimex in 2018, I mentioned this, but it was at that point still an idea, a glimmer in the eye of some Chinese planner. Now it's gone well beyond that, and it's become an actual policy package. And the basic idea is this: the big urban areas in East China will be allowed to continue to grow. In fact, they'll be the focus of this investment. So this is not at all like some past Chinese policies where they were trying to shift growth inland. That's yesterday's policy. That's done with. The premise of this is that growth should be in the more productive, higher tech, more densely populated city clusters of Eastern China. But they still want to control the growth of the biggest central cities, especially Beijing and Shanghai. And so the idea is new cities will be built alongside the existing urban centers. The new cities, they tell us, should not be thought of as satellite cities that are dependent on the central city, that are, suburban commuter hubs. That idea is rejected. Instead, these are supposed to be completely independent, fully functioning cities that integrate all different urban functions, but which are connected to other nodes in this urban network by super fast transport and super fast communication. So this is, many of these ideas are good ideas. They kind of reflect some of the most recent thinking about what makes a city functionally effective, but they're also very, very ambitious. And the past record of human beings trying to consciously build cities is not very promising. And it's the great cities of the world have grown up organically, and the planned cities of the world, unless they're then allowed to develop organically, generally speaking, have not been super, super successful. But maybe China will be different. Let me just quickly show you some brightly colored maps, because I think I really enjoy looking at some of these brightly colored maps. Here's a quick flash on the new city that is under construction in near Beijing. It's called Xiong'an. And you can see that the idea is to create a triangle. Here's old Beijing, here's Tianjin, and here's the new Xiong'an. So the idea is we link all of the vertices of this triangle with super high-speed transport. Here, by the way, is the Winter Olympics site for 2022. This new city, and you see how green it is and how it's laid in one of the few surviving wetlands of the North China Plain. The idea is to make this an intelligent, smart city, a hub that would be a testing area for mass implementation of, for example, autonomous vehicles, and get this, digital currency. Exactly how you can implement digital currency in one new city is a little bit beyond me, but you see the idea that these new cities can be testing grounds for a wide range of new technologies. Now, if we go down to the other end of China, the Pearl River Delta, the Pearl River Delta already has this characteristic that it doesn't have a single dominant city, right? Hong Kong is an important part of it. Shenzhen, right on the border of Hong Kong, is an important part of it. Guangzhou, the traditional urban center. Dongguan, the emerging manufacturing superpower, mid-tech superpower. So the idea is to combine all these existing medium-sized by Chinese standards, still large cities by global standards, into this network of high-speed communication. And we already see that there's a bridge that connects this part of Hong Kong with Zhuhai and Macau. That's already in place. So again, it's the same vision, even though the starting point is different. The vision is the same, of a cluster of cities tightly integrated that forms a very high productivity output. And guess who's the leader in this process? Alibaba, great company, great private company. One of their subsidiaries is called City Brain. They've been running the city of Hangzhou for several years and claim significant advances in smart city management. Let's just take a quick look at Shanghai for a minute too. I wanted to do this today because just in the last month, Shanghai has announced its own program. Here, of course, is a picture of Shanghai from satellite. It's a huge, metropolitan region. It's about the same size as Mexico City, is my understanding. But it's quite concentrated right now in a single. Here's Pudong, which is of course all new construction, and here's Puxi, which is has been in many respects preserved, even though the population has soared. But still, it's very much a center. And so just in the last month, Shanghai said we're going to build 5 independent and comprehensive node cities around the traditional central city, which is in some ways exciting And just as a cautionary note, we should remember that exactly 20 years ago, Shanghai introduced a similar plan, although it was based on sort of suburban satellite cities, and universally agreed to have failed. Well, so let's bring this towards a conclusion by just quickly emphasizing some of the most recent adaptations in all this policy, besides the new infrastructure. The other thing we absolutely have to mention is Chinese policy towards supply chains. And of course, it's not surprising. Obviously, China has to react to the embargo of Huawei instituted by the Trump administration and the broader specter of limitations on semiconductor equipment in particular. But we see already 3 kinds of response to these tensions, all focused on the idea that the government will intervene and restructure existing supply chains. So number 1, all supply chains are going through a kind of audit process with the objective of making them independently controllable and secure. So that will definitely have an impact across the board. Second, the second point, that increasing efforts to boost technological innovation and import substitution. So import substitution is now explicitly integrated into current Chinese policy. But also look at the third one. In supply chains where we have the upper hand, we should seek to increase the dependence of these networks and their global networks, increase the dependence on us. So it's explicitly a kind of two-directional policy that says, yeah, we have to be more secure in our own supply chains, but we also want to foster mutual dependency in order to give us a way to respond to things that the US does. All right, two quick screens of conclusions, and I'll wrap up. First of all, just let's grasp the nature of the objective that China is pursuing. They are seeking to retain the benefits of a market economy, but shaping it through government policy, let's call it steerage, to a degree that is absolutely unprecedented. This is different. It's not just that China breaks with neoliberal prescriptions about the division between government and the economy. We're long past that point. It's that China has embraced a responsibility and an intention to direct the development of the economy in a way that is new. And yet, this policy is definitely too recent to be given credit for the tremendous economic achievements that China has made. It's been very expensive already. And so far, there really are no clear cases where you can say China's industrial policy has succeeded. It's important intellectually. Not only that, there are substantial risks, financial risks, and also the question of how China will handle the fact that a lot of these projects will fail, even as some succeed. Now, let's be absolutely clear. Chinese policymakers understand this 100% as a part of their commitment to a continuing market economy. They see themselves as being like venture capitalists. They're going to invest in 10. They know that 9 of them are going to fail. But if that one succeeds and can be nurtured and fostered into a national champion, then they're okay. And that means they have to have effective policies to let the failures go bankrupt, that they don't absorb resources and become a drag on the overall economy. And China has a lot of advantages: market size, manufacturing base, human resources. And guess what? There really is a new technological revolution rolling out that's going to affect productivity everywhere. And China is pretty well positioned to take advantage of that technological revolution. So I'm definitely not saying that China is going to fail. On the contrary, I think we'll see China in the next decade or two as quite successful, even though there are lots of problems with these policies. And unfortunately, I think that success and the continuation of the policies is going to ensure continuing conflict with many nations, including the United States. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. Very interesting, and thank you very much also for your effort to updating some of your conclusions and suggestions for 2021, no? Which we just started, no? So we have a group of questions. Barry, I don't know if you have access to the questions. Usually what we try to do, Barry, is to have a round of 3 or 4 questions, and then maybe a second and even a third round, and then we finish, no? I would like, since I have the microphone, to start with 2 brief questions from myself, no? One is, what is your opinion in terms of the discussion on industrial policy for the near future, no? Industrial policy since the 1980s, 90s, 2000s was sometimes mentioned as an F word, no? A word you could not mention and discuss. Now, with the results and conclusions of your book regarding China, but also in the increasing tensions with the United States, apparently industrial policy is completely justified in China, but probably also in the United States and other countries, no? What is your opinion on this topic? And the second brief topic, it is very implicit in your book and also in your presentation regarding the role of cities, provinces, and municipalities in China of this big concept of industrial policy. But what is the qualitative and quantitative role of these cities, provinces and municipalities beyond the national or the central government? No? Because historically we always think that industrial policy is steered by a central or the federal or national government. But in your presentation, you have mentioned 10, 20 cities, municipalities, and even I would say probably much less on the central government, at least in the case of China. No? 2 questions, and then lots of other questions through the chat. No?
Thanks. Those are great questions, and they're definitely part of an ongoing global discussion. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the reputation of industrial policy has certainly soared in the last decade or so, from being a dirty word to being something that's now seen as being considerably more attractive. I would say in the United States, I think the Biden administration wants to have an industrial policy and will have an industrial policy. They're still a little cautious about the label. The Republican Party is still, strongly opposed to any kind of self-conscious industrial policy, although a lot depends on sort of what definitions you have. So absolutely, the pendulum is swinging, and I think that's a good thing. But I do think there is a risk here, and that the risk is that we conflate what China is doing with the scale of the things that other countries are contemplating. I mean, even if the United States, if Biden is successful in all of his proposals, which involve things like, creating secondary supply chains for rare earth minerals, improving domestic production of semiconductor manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. If he does all those things, the program will still be tiny compared to what China is doing. So we're talking about a completely different scale. And as I say, China may well end up succeeding with these programs, but it's intellectually not right to give these programs credit for China's extraordinary performance. China's extraordinary performance comes from marketization and private enterprise. So, and again, it's based on a high level of infrastructure investment. So, I mean, if you had to boil things down to super simple lessons, say for Mexico or other economies, I would say the lesson from China is invest more in infrastructure. It's not have an industrial policy. It's invest more in infrastructure. As far as the second question, also a great question. The flexibility that China gets from sort of having the central government lay out these guidelines and set up the framework, and then having local governments really be primarily in charge of making them a reality, is probably mostly a source of strength. But not always. Right? It's a source of strength because there's a degree of competition. Things in Shenzhen happen, as you know well, that probably could never have happened in Beijing, and stir things up and make the economy more dynamic. On the other hand, for instance, when we look at those Shanghai new cities, they're all inside the boundary of Shanghai municipality. Is that logical? That's true for political reasons. In some sense, if the vision is a correct one, it should cross the administrative boundaries and incorporate Suzhou and Wuxi and those are the real alternative nodes in a lower Yangtze urban system. So local government is super important, sometimes maybe too important, but it's definitely a key feature of the Chinese model that gives it flexibility and strength.
Thank you very much. And again, I don't know if you want to see the questions and pick some of them, or if you want me to read some of them. You can see the chat.
I can see the questions. Yeah, there are a lot of.
You are free to choose however you want to group them if you want to. No, you do not necessarily have to respond to all of them. No.
It's interesting. A couple of people have asked why shipping costs have exploded, and that's not too directly related to what I'm talking about, but I think it does pull out something very, very interesting, which is that I think the basic reason is because few of us anticipated that even though COVID had a huge negative impact on our economies overall, it also created demand for a whole series of stay-at-home goods, including computers and personal protective gear and all these things, all of which are produced primarily in China. And so the manufacturing recovery was faster than people expected. The recovery of China's exports was much faster than people expected. And the shipping companies had to scramble to reduce capacity a little bit just to make sure they survived in the case of the epidemic, and therefore there wasn't enough capacity when this new surge of unanticipated exports came out. So I think that's a very important part of sort of the overall picture. Great question. What are the expectations for Chinese workers? You know, China has pursued labor substituting technologies with enthusiasm that no other country has shown. And now part of this is because they are indeed at a flex point in their demographics, right? The total size of the labor force has plateaued and is starting very slowly now to decrease. So Chinese planners look at all this and they say, okay, we should make sure we can continue to grow despite this labor constraint. But I think they are creating a serious possibility that the demand for unskilled labor will decline when there's still hundreds of millions of unskilled workers in China. Scott Rozelle has written a very interesting book about this. You know, what it comes down to is that the pushing the economy as quickly as possible towards a high-tech future does risk leaving people behind. And if I were a Chinese policymaker, I would worry more about that. Yeah.
Barry, there are 2 or 3 questions. If I simply highlight them, one that might be of interest for several of us. One by a post by Carlos Piña regarding all this framework of industrial policy in different periods. Does this pose a threat to the United States and to other countries? Might this increase the tensions with the United States? No, there is one group of questions in that regard. A second question also by Jose Calderoni, asking about industrial policy and the military sector. No? What is your opinion on that? And the third question by Eugenio Anguiano, who is also with us, and the name of the chair is thanks to him also, regarding what are the financial limits of industrial policy. Is the national debt in China a barrier, or is this issue limitless? No.
Yeah.
3 big questions that might be relevant.
Question. Let me start with the last one because I think it's so important, and I didn't say much about it. China's got a big economy. You know, it's the second biggest economy in the world. So in absolute terms, no, it's not a limit. The debt level is not so high that China can't take out more debt if it wants to. So in this mechanical sense, it's not, you know, we can't look at this and say, oh, China can't afford it. China can afford it, but it has to handle it well. So right now, the current policy in China is, they call it deleveraging, but actually it's essentially keeping the debt burden more or less stable. So that means that actually in the course of 2020, there were some very substantial bankruptcies among the very high priority semiconductor sector and quite a few bond defaults. So the government's maintaining kind of a tough line because they understand that the very high priority they gave to semiconductors induced a lot of entry, and some of that entry was by really shoddy companies. But some of these financial difficulties are among more important companies that are actually pretty integral to the industrial policy effort, like Tsinghua Unigroup, which defaulted on almost $10 billion worth of US dollar denominated bonds. Well, that's kind of shocking. But it also shows a will to keep the financial discipline in place. If they can maintain that will and provide the government funding to keep it going, then it's sustainable, right? Because yeah, you build up debt, but then somebody pays the costs. The overall pace of default is not destabilizing as long as markets don't panic. It's still much lower than default rates in the United States, for instance. So I think it's sustainable, but predicated on the idea that Chinese macro and financial policy stays very rational and very tough. And it's hard to see how that will continue to be true. Because number one, deleveraging is already imposing lots of costs on dynamic private firms. So they're unhappy. And lots of the local investment funds and local projects have strong local patrons who don't want to let those firms and projects go bankrupt. So I think there's nothing inevitable about the problems, and they're doing okay right now. But to thread that needle, for several years going forward, I think that's going to be quite difficult. And that's what I worry about in the future. It's not the absolute financial sustainability, but the dangers that can come when you let your take your eye off the ball. I think we definitely have to address sort of the other related two issues. Is this a threat to other countries? I think the answer has to be yes. It is a threat in two ways. I mean, one is that the international capitalist order depends on some kind of agreement about what the rules of competition are. I mean, if we look at the European Union, there we see the strongest set of rules, right, about fair competition. Those are stronger than the rules that apply through the WTO, but they're based on the same philosophy, which is that competition is between companies, and that government support for companies should be limited. Now, China is essentially saying, well, no, we're the national team. Our state enterprises and our private firms have to work together to be the national team, and we're going to promote our national team with all the resources that we have at our disposal. That creates a tremendous challenge. Do we treat, and the US has essentially said, we're going to treat Huawei as the cutting edge of the Chinese national team, and therefore we're not going to allow it to control our telecommunication system. I think it's inevitable that countries will react that way, whether you think it's right or not. If countries see themselves as being in strategic competition, and hey, American warships and Chinese warships, sail across each other every day in the South China Sea. So the reality of strategic competition is there. So I think it's a very deep problem, not I guess I answered that perhaps a little bit too unequivocally in the sense of implying that there's an immediate economic threat. I don't mean that, but what I do mean is that there's an immediate challenge to the rules by which different countries, which have different values and all kinds of different political systems, but which it seemed up until about a decade ago had agreed on a set of rules for economic interaction. And I think now that's under challenge and it's really questionable. The pure military implications of these technologies are, of course, immense. I mean, in some ways, the so-called smart battlefield that we saw the first versions of in Iraq, 30 years ago, is now a reality. And there's no question that Chinese investment in these areas, and particularly through the program of so-called civilian military fusion, is designed to make the Chinese military much more capable. And that's also, I think, a great challenge for all of us.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. Look, we don't want to take too much of your time, but I would say maybe there are 2 or 3 final questions to round up the arguments. No, on the one hand, Esther Reyes, for example, asks very specifically regarding differences in the plan to build node cities in Shanghai and proposals in the early 21st century and the latest plans you mentioned for 2020-21. No? Do you see there important qualitative and quantitative differences in this 20-year period?
For sure, the plans in some sense are quite different. And you could almost say that the current plan is in some ways the opposite of the 2001 plan. The 2001 plan essentially said all the core urban functions are going to stay in Shanghai. All of the financial institutions are going to move to Pudong. And then these new towns are going to be essentially bedroom communities. We're going to make them very nice. We're going to make them European style. There was a Dutch town, there was a French town. So, it was all about amenities for a residential town. The idea now here is to do the opposite. It's to say, we're going to create a new city out on the outskirts that, well, it's going to be everything a city needs to be. So it's definitely different, but you have to wonder, there are reasons why people want to live in the big, exciting cities, and there are reasons why those cities are economically productive. So just to set up, a new city, we already see this in Xiong'an. What's Xiong'an supposed to be? Well, it's outside Beijing. It's supposed to be smart, and it's supposed to be green. Yeah. So it should be a high-tech city, right? Yeah. But wait a minute, all of the really high-tech educational institutions or research institutes are on the north side of Beijing. Do people want to move down to Xiong'an? No, they don't. Are you going to force them? Well, it depends. So what are these new cities in China actually going to be? We don't know. But they certainly see their objective as to be different from the program that didn't work 20 years ago. Absolutely.
And look, I would say two last questions to round up some of the arguments. One question also regarding this territorial development within China and linked to industrial policy. No? What about the China's West? No? In your presentation, but also in many policies and initiatives, there is always the discussion that these policies try to integrate China's West, But most of the case studies and explicitly what you have presented, well, the most Western city is probably Chongqing, no? And what about the rest, no? Do you see in real terms an active integration of China's West?
Well, I mean, so I think Chinese policymakers are grappling with one of the side effects of integration. In other words, compared to, my God, if we think back to almost 25 years ago when the Western development policy was introduced, the situation is qualitatively completely different. Right? The Western areas back then were, you wouldn't call them isolated, but I mean, it was hard to get there. The costs in terms of time and money of operating in the West was high. That's completely changed right now. Sichuan is crisscrossed with freeways, high-speed rail. I mean, everything's different. But when you do that, one of the things that happens is people in the West say, oh, okay, well, I can leave now. And so there has been a significant rebalancing of economic activity inland. But now going forward, you've got to the point where there's a new round of development of services and high-tech manufacturing and high-tech services, as well as regular services. And it's pretty clear that the future of that is more in the East. The anti-poverty program, which claimed to have basically eliminated poverty, extreme poverty, we should say, malnutrition poverty, by the end of 2020, to a significant degree relied on moving people out of areas that were just not sustainable. So I think, yes, there is a recognition that the redistribution to the West has done most of what it can do, and that future development is going to occur more in the eastern coastal areas.
Mm. Okay, and look, a final question, Barry, that goes a little bit beyond the scope of your book and your conference, but nevertheless, I think an interesting reflection and question posed by Bruno Gandelgruber. What does this discussion on industrial policy until 2021 mean for the Chinese model? No? Does this mean that China is a new form of state capitalism with new forms of regulations? You have discussed this in detail. Is China a socialist economy or not in several articles? But does this discussion on industrial policy somehow change your opinions and analysis in the last 5 to 10 years, or not necessarily?
Yes, it does change my opinion and analysis, because China today is more centralized, more ambitious, and the role of the Communist Party is more central. So a number of us, there's a scholar, Jude Blanchett at CSIS, a think tank in Washington, D.C. He suggests we shouldn't call it state capitalism anymore. We should call it party capitalism, or CCP Incorporated. Because now the party is embedded in the corporate governance structure, certainly of state firms, and also to a much lesser degree, but more than before, with private firms. So the system is becoming more authoritarian. It's becoming more unified under a single direction, and that's troubling. It's troubling. It's not the China model as we understood it a decade ago. It's something else, and it's something harder edged and more tightly controlled.
Okay, fantastic, Barry, very interesting. I see Eugenio Anguiano is here, and I'm sure he would agree very much with your conclusions. He has been writing on this political, new authoritarian developments in the last 5 to 10 years. No, but this would be for another discussion and another lecture. No, Barry, I thank you very much for your time, not only today, but since 2018, no, when we were able to host you. I thank you very much for your patience in these weeks, months, years to write the book, no? And we're very happy it has been downloaded more than 1,700 times in these 10 days this week. And I would simply like to invite everybody to read the book. No, I think it's a provocative, interesting document for all those interested in, again, in China, but also on new forms of industrial policy, which in some circles in Latin America, but also in Mexico, is somehow fashionable. And again, China is not completely irrelevant in this discussion, no? As you very well highlight in terms of the scale, no? You want to think about this? Well, let's see how many digits such a quantitative approach in US dollars requires, no? But also in terms of the form, no? It's not necessarily an issue of picking the winners, etc., but you were very clearly highlighting the issue of the importance of infrastructure, for example, no? Again, the political structure in China makes some of these policies more viable than in other countries, no? Even in the US, probably, no? But again, it's a food for thought, and I can simply invite everybody to read this document. And thank you very much, Barry, no? And thank you very much again to Agenda Asia and Simon Levy Dava for supporting this effort. We hope we will continue with this in 2021. No?
I do too, and thank you very much, Enrique. It's a great pleasure to see old friends again. I look forward to the day when we can meet in person.
Beautiful. Okay, so thank you very much, and we will be in touch. In 2 weeks, we will have another presentation, and we will keep you informed. No? Have a good day, and have a good week also. We will be in touch, Barry. No? Thank you. Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.